You're watching Euronews Now. I'm Takumbo Silako with your top stories. A new strategy for old enemies. NATO says it wants to boost its military forces to counter Russia and China. We'll be digging into the alliance plans. Also, Amnesty International is accusing Russia of carrying out war crimes by deliberately attacking civilians during its strike on a theatre in Mariupol back in March. And after France's biggest Islamist trial, survivors speak out as 20 men are sentenced over their roles in the deadly 2015 Paris attacks.
NATO country leaders recharged their cultural batteries at the Prado Museum ahead of the final day of a momentous summit in Madrid. They have already expanded the alliance by 2, formally inviting Sweden and Finland to their number, and they have committed themselves to a major overhaul of NATO's military mission.
So today, leaders have endorsed NATO's new strategic concept. And it is published as we speak. And this is the new strategic concept. The current one was agreed in 2010, and this is very different compared to what we agreed back then. It makes clear that Russia poses the most significant and direct threat to our security.
Along with pledging support for Ukraine in its fight against Russia for as long as it takes, NATO is strengthening its eastern flank, transforming the NATO response force, while the US has also agreed to ramp up its military presence in Europe. Meanwhile, the leaders of Sweden, Finland, Norway, Denmark and Iceland have been reflecting on NATO's new-look Nordic bloc.
We have to keep in mind that Finland has, during decades, and specifically during the last decade, been building up cooperation, enhanced partnership with NATO, bilateral cooperation with the USA, with the UK.
Russia's actions have dominated the summit, but the alliance is also looking to other directions too, namely what it calls the systemic challenges posed by the People's Republic of China. It means while NATO is set to expand membership, it also looks to reinforcing partnerships with non-NATO countries.
NATO leaders say they want to send a clear and unmistakable message to Russia that they're more united than ever over its war on Ukraine. That means more troops and weapons on the ground and a new strategic purpose for the alliance. Well, for more on this, let's talk to Fabrice Poitier. He's a senior defence fellow at the International Institute of Strategic Studies. Welcome again to the programme. Tell us, what will the NATO of tomorrow look like?
Well, I think it will look like the NATO of yesterday, but on steroid. Clearly, they are augmenting the Allied reaction force. There are going to be many more troops and heavy equipment based on the deployed on the eastern flank. But fundamentally, we are not seeing necessarily a NATO with permanent presence on the eastern flank, which is what actually many of the eastern allies were asking for. So I think they are just they're going much further than where NATO was before the 24th of February, but they're not going as far as many other allies were asking.
But they're also putting a hand out to many partner countries, or partner members as they call them. It seems as if the expansion is firmly in their sights.
I mean, expansion, consolidation, depending on the perspective you take, but indeed NATO is now increasingly working with like-minded countries, not just in the Euro-Atlantic area, but also beyond, especially in the Indo-Pacific. But I think what's important to remember is the O in NATO, the organization, is still punching way below its weight when it comes to support to Ukraine. NATO is doing very, very little, and I think it could play a much bigger role in helping the Ukrainians build up their weapons, but also their forces.
Okay, well, if Jens Stoltenberg is listening to this and wants your advice, what would you tell him?
Well, I will advise him to launch a NATO training mission for Ukrainian forces, which could start on NATO territory, which will help to actually fuse all the allies' efforts, which are essentially bilateral efforts, and amplify and basically scale up what the Ukrainians really need, which is fresh, well-trained recruits who can go and reinforce the Ukrainian forces on the front line. And that possibly that NATO training mission after the war could become actually a permanent NATO training mission on the Ukrainian soil, as NATO is now doing in Georgia.
It seems like such a long time ago when Ukraine was expressing ambitions to perhaps join NATO. Is it still a prospective candidate?
I think that's the decision to the Ukrainian leadership, and as far as I understand, this is still something very much in their sight. Whether it's a realistic prospect, that's another question. And of course, the fact that now they have obtained the candidate status for EU membership release some of the pressure to ask and deliver on the NATO membership. So I think it's one thing at a time, but more importantly, this is a sovereign decision by the Ukrainian state and no one else.
Ukrainian forces announced they have pushed back Russian troops along Snake Island, an island placed off the Black Sea port of Odessa. Russian troops have faced relentless resistance from Ukrainian troops on the island. Russia's defense ministry described their withdrawal as a goodwill gesture, saying it had completed all operations it had set out to do, adding that the export of Ukrainian grain from Odessa could now resume.
Spain has not exactly been what this Ukrainian family thought it would be. They fled Kyiv at the beginning of June, 4 months after Russia's assault began. However, after passing through the first reception centre, they discovered they had nowhere to go.
For a week we lived in a hotel in Pozuelo. Then with our suitcases and the girls, we looked for a place to stay, for somewhere to eat, from morning till night, where to go, who to ask for help, and with what organisation.
Different associations found them accommodation in the province of Orense and Vitoria, but there was no vacancies, so they returned to Madrid. They faced life on the streets before a charity put them up in a hostel.
Honestly, Spain is not safer than Ukraine. We even thought about going back to Ukraine, because we were expecting help. But in the end, we found ourselves on the street, in a foreign country, with no money, no food, no housing. It's very dangerous. We have 2 small children, and in general, it's very stressful.
Foundation Madrina, which found Valentina a place to stay, has a call centre for refugees seeking accommodation. But as the months drag on, support is running thin.
This family has been with us for 3 months. The electricity and water bills have gone up a lot. We can't take care of this family.
Since the beginning of the war, some 125,000 Ukrainian refugees have arrived in Spain. The government has announced an aid package of €400 from July for those who are left out of the public reception system because they have not gone through one of the formal channels.
But this foundation believes something even more important could be done.
We need to incorporate these job seekers into the Spanish job system and get their qualifications recognised as soon as possible. We also need to offer companies who are hiring them tax deductions.
The Spanish Ministry of Inclusion, Social Security and Migration denies that there are Ukrainian families who have not been accommodated. They say it has enough places for displaced people.
Ferdinand Marcos Jr., whose father was announced a dictator, was sworn in as President of the Philippines in Manila on Thursday. He succeeds Rodrigo Duterte as the country's 17th president. His rise to power, 36 years after an army-backed revolt removed his infamous father, upends politics in the Asian democracy. Israeli lawmakers voted on Thursday in favour of a bill to dissolve parliament. Foreign Minister Yair Lapid has taken over as interim Prime Minister, and fresh elections are due to be held on November 1st. Until now, Naftali Bennett had been PM of a coalition, but he says he won't stand in the upcoming poll.
Much more news and analysis coming up for you after this break.